Gosh, I'm smaller than Mike by a long way. Thank you for the introduction. I'm only going to tell you this because Rosie told me to say it, and you never not do what Rosie tells you. That the island actually sold 2 million copies, not 1 million, which is still something I can't quite believe. But I think when I've finished talking about the subject matter, perhaps it will explain a little bit more about why the story captured people. The title of what I was going to talk to you about, and it's all M's, all the speakers tonight, Marcus, Mike, Mark and Martin. So my title is Mystery, Myth and Monsters, a Misunderstood Disease. The disease I'm going to talk to you about is leprosy. This island of Spinalonga is just off the north coast of Crete. It's a tiny island, and it takes about 35 minutes to walk the entire circumference. In the 18th century, it was a Venetian fortification. In the 19th century, it was occupied by the Turks. And in the 20th century, it became a leper colony. And now in the 21st century, it's becoming one of the most visited sites in Crete. It vies very closely with the Minoan Palace at Knossos. My first visit there was as a tourist, and I wasn't planning to write a novel of any kind, but I went there on a boat one day with my family because we were on holiday in Crete and we needed something to do for the afternoon. And none of us had ever been to a leper colony before, so that sounded interesting. So off we went in a boat, and I rather ghoulishly expected to see maybe the remains of a hospital and perhaps a very large cemetery. What else would anyone expect? Instead of that, what we actually saw was something that looked very like any other Cretan village. It was a little high street with some shops, some dilapidated houses, some churches, a bakery, a communal laundry, and the kind of ubiquitous pots of geraniums and basil that you get in any Greek village. So I was surprised and actually rather intrigued, and I immediately went away and started to try and find out more about leprosy. I realised that I'd misunderstood it. What I discovered very quickly was that leprosy is one of the most misunderstood diseases of any disease, and it is the most ancient. The first mention of leprosy in writing is in a document from about 1500 years BC, and it's extensively written about in Leviticus. There are 2 chapters devoted to how the priest should treat somebody with leprosy. Every time I read those 2 chapters, they're chapters 13 and 14, if anyone is interested or nerdy enough or biblical enough to want to go and read up on them. They go on at great lengths about how the person should be made to live alone, how they should wear their head bare, they should have obviously all their clothes burnt, and they should go around crying, unclean, unclean. It also talks about atonement and defilement, and there's no doubt in my interpretation of those chapters that there's obviously the fear of the contagion in there, but there's also a moral judgment being made about the person with leprosy. And for many, many years, the leprosy patient was perceived as somebody who was cursed by God. It was a mysterious disease. Nobody knew how it was caught, but anybody that had it was suspected of being punished in some way. And this continued for literally thousands of years. There was no treatment of any kind that alleviated. Some occasional quack remedies made with arsenic, gold, for example, and snake oil. And in fact, one that was considered well into the still used well into the 20th century, that was made out of a nut that was injected into people, and apparently it alleviated a little bit, but basically did absolutely nothing. Obviously, the stigma of this disease, apart from the fact it was considered a curse from God, the other part of the stigma, of course, was what it actually does to the human body. It makes people extremely ugly, and there's no other word for that, the way of describing it. It can deform not only your limbs, but your face very badly. It is literally, as I said in the title, it can turn people, visually at least, into monsters. So it was a disease that brought with it huge amount of fear. The scientists, of course, in the 19th century did not take the idea of it being a curse as gospel. They were in pursuit of something that would help them to cure it. And in fact, there were international leprosy congresses throughout the 19th century where leprosy doctors from every continent met together in different parts of the world to try and share anything that they'd found. But they were generally, I think, probably quite futile events. Oddly enough, in a very unexpected country, in Norway, where there was an epidemic of leprosy in the 19th century, it galvanized a group of doctors to try and get to the next stage, to try and identify a bacteria, because that's what they believed was at the heart of it all. And in 1873, a very controversial doctor called Arnaud Hansen managed to get the bacteria under his microscope, to see it under the microscope. I'm not remotely scientific, so my research into the disease, I had a lot of help from a wonderful doctor at the London School of Hygiene, but she explained to me that the leprosy bacteria is known as the lazy bacteria, and it takes 13 days to double, so apparently that makes it very hard to grow in vitro, very hard to do any research with. Anyway, the wonderful Hansen, who actually was one of the first people who was tried for medical misconduct, because in order to do his experiments, he actually conducted some rather unethical experiments on some of his patients. But putting that aside, he, in the leprosy story, is a hero, and the disease is often called Hansen's disease after him. So there he had this bacteria, which was very exciting, mostly because for the first time it gave out the message that this disease was a bacterial infection. It was not a curse from God, and it meant that if you had it, you were unlucky rather than bad. So it was a great revelation, and actually at that moment it should have meant the end of the stigma, but alas it didn't, and still hasn't done to this day. The race was then on for finding the cure with the bacteria. That obviously took them a great deal closer to getting somewhere with that. But it wasn't until the 1940s that they discovered that the use of something called promine, which is a sulfur-based substance, could be injected into the body to try and reduce the symptoms. Unfortunately, that proved to be a killer in itself, and it attacked the liver, and people died of hepatitis rather than leprosy. So it was a terrible and disappointing full start. However, 10 years later, they got close and they found that dapsone, which is another sulfur derivative, effectively treated and ultimately cured the bacteria. I'll tell you, just because I know so many people have these misunderstandings about leprosy, I'll just tell you very briefly about what leprosy actually is and what it does to the body. Only 3% of us are predisposed to develop the disease at all. So actually, it's not like tuberculosis, whereby if I sneezed and I have TB and you're standing close by, you would probably get TB. If I had leprosy and I'm even surrounded by my family, the chances are they probably wouldn't ever get it. So it's not a rapidly contagious disease. The second thing about it, it is very slow to develop. I think most people think leprosy is something that once you've got it, you lose your arms, your legs, your toes, parts of your face within days. Actually, the first signs of it you can have for 5, 10, even 15 years before they develop into the sort of more aggressive form of it. And it might take the form of just a patch on your skin that can be mistaken for psoriasis. Often the pigmentation is slightly lost and you can't actually feel it, which is the way that leprosy is diagnosed very quickly now. You can actually, if somebody can't feel a patch on their skin, there's a possibility it's leprosy. What it's actually doing is attacking the nerve endings. That's the sort of way in which leprosy does destroy people. Gradually, it attacks the sensitivity to temperature. So if you were cooking or walking, for example, in the areas where it still survives, you wouldn't feel if you got a blister, you wouldn't feel if you burnt yourself. And that leads to ulceration and ultimately infection, and that's when people lose parts of their body. So that's what leprosy really is. Having found the cure, my leprosy colony out in Crete was emptied of people. Everybody left. They were cured. And it should have been the end of the story. A cure for an incurable disease. I mean, how fantastic must that have seemed to the scientists? But what they didn't realise was that the stigma of this disease is so deep culturally and within different societies that people who thought that they might have it still didn't come forward for diagnosis. The fear of being branded an outcast was greater than the desire to be cured. So shockingly, even now, there are 500,000 new cases of leprosy every year around the world. The majority of them, 70% of those new cases, are in India, and the balance largely in Brazil, and the rest spread out among other South American and Asian countries. So it's still a very frustrating situation for the doctors. And what they're now trying to cure is the stigma, in a sense, rather than the disease. Just going back to Spinalonga briefly, because I suppose what interested me about going there was not, I was interested in the science of the disease, obviously the reasons why people were there, but what really grabbed me was this evidence of the way people had lived in that leprosy hospital. Taken away from the society on the mainland. In a sense, they stopped being outcasts. They had each other's support. And in the research that I was able to do at the time, because everything was written in Greek and I didn't speak it, but the one thing I found out, and oddly I didn't put this in the book, they actually had a satirical magazine. And I didn't put that in because I thought, well, everybody will assume I'm making some reference to my husband. So I turned it into just a newspaper. But these people had elections, they had families, they had every human emotion. And that's what fascinated me, the way that people can survive. There is one more slide. I have no idea how much time. I'm so about. Can I just show you one more picture, because actually it's unfair and unrealistic to talk about leprosy without showing a picture of someone with leprosy. This gentleman on the left of the picture is Manoli Fundulaikis, who I would say over the 3 years I knew him became probably one of my dearest friends. You can see the effects that leprosy has on his body. He had huge hands that he could hardly move. He'd lost quite a lot of his nose, and he had very sort of distended ears, which are a characteristic of leprosy. But he was one of the most extraordinary people I've ever met. Unlike, I think, almost anyone I've ever met, he never ever complained about anything. He never talked about himself. He was a wise, witty, and very loving person. He was the person that I learnt Greek for so that we could communicate. And that shot is actually a picture of both of us playing leprosy patients in the Greek television series that's been made and is showing now on Greek television. And Manoli, he died very soon after that picture was taken, actually, but he fulfilled his ambition, in a sense, to play this scene where the cure had happened and we were going to be leaving Spinalonga together, and he insisted on losing his walking stick and just holding my arm. And actually in his hand there he's holding an icon, as he was a deeply religious man, but a very wonderful person, and proved to me that being somebody who'd had leprosy did not make him an outcast. He was absolutely the centre of the village in Crete where he lived. I do get asked, because I was lucky to kind of stumble on this story, and it is ridiculous to write a book having never written any fiction and wake up and find it sold 2 million copies. It's absurd, and people ask me why I think that happened. It's a very simple story. The only explanation I can really give is that I think that the oldest disease in the world, the oldest taboo, is somehow a metaphor for many modern taboos. And I think everybody has different things in their minds that come to them when you say modern taboo. There are still many, many of them. Thank you very much.